again with another video, and still continuing with this collection pack here. So now we're going to talk about and review Soylent Green. Hope you can see it all right. Stars Charlton Heston and directed by Richard Fleischer. And this was interesting. I mean, I do have, I could say, a couple of nitpicks with the film, and I'll get more into that here in a little bit. But the plot, so the film takes place in 2022, which is weird, and the Earth is overpopulated, New York City is overcrowded, and the constant heat is unbearable. The city's infrastructure is broken down, water is rationed, and fresh food is non-existent. Rather, most of the population lives on this food, or so-called food, if you want to call it that. I don't know what you want to call it, but Soylent Green. And there's like these different flavors of Soylent, which is made from soybeans and lentils. And it's made from ocean vegetation, and it's formed into like these wafers. And in this environment, you have our main character, played by Charlton Heston. He's this detective, Robert Thorne, and he's assigned to investigate the death of this higher up figure who was murdered. And then we find out later that, you know, he was a board member of the Soylent Corporation. And then our main character discovers something far more disturbing, and that's the plot to this movie. Now, the film's director again is Richard Fleischer. This is the same director that brought us Fantastic Voyage, which is a good 60s sci-fi movie. Conan the Destroyer, which is a fun sequel and probably my favorite Conan film. He also directed Amityville 3D, and some other stuff. I mean, Richard Fleischer, his direction here is okay. I would say, to me, the most interesting aspect of the film is the plot, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. Now, the cast here, Charlton Heston, to me, does a fine job acting-wise. I mean, maybe you could say that compared to the Omega Man, he doesn't bring as much energy. I know some people out there felt that he was miscast here. But, to me, he did fine. But Charlton Heston's a great actor. I mean, Planet of the Apes, The Ten Commandments, again, classic actor, and does a fine job here. You also have, Leah Taylor-Young in the film. You have Chuck Connors, who plays this character that, Charlton Heston's investigating. You have his boss in the film, who's played by Brock Peters. You have this character, Saul, that, him and Charlton Heston work together, and they're investigating the Soylent Corporation. And I liked, their rapport in the film. I liked the character of Saul. So again, the cast, does a fine job. Again, the concept, the story of the film is the most interesting aspect, because, it takes place in 2022, and here we are in 2022, and you have certain scenes. I mean, for example, you have scenes where, you see a lot of people in the streets, and some people are wearing masks, and they're hitting up these different, vendors of Soylent, and they're selling, different flavors of Soylent, and water's rationed, and there's a point where a riot breaks out, and you have this like dump truck that rides through the streets and is scooping up people and dumping them in the back, like trash. And again, it's just very eye-opening. I mean, there's a point in the film where Charlton Heston's character brings Saul, like a piece of meat, like a piece of beef, and the character of Saul cries because, beef you can't have in the future or in this movie. But, I mean, we're kind of getting to that point already, because look of how many fast food places now are trying to push, plant-based foods and all that stuff. So again, a lot of the stuff that is, thought of, in terms of the plot in this movie and the story, the concept is really interesting. Because you see, kind of where we're going. Pushing a lot of, plant-based foods, and, trying to take meat out of the equation and beef, and, eat more greens, and which we all should eat greens. I mean, everybody should eat some type of green, but nobody wants to eat a fucking, lettuce burger every day, or plant-based foods all the time. Some of it's nasty. But again, that's what's interesting about this movie, is the story. Because again, it mentions a lot of the stuff that we're starting to see now. A film that was made 50 years ago, and it's kind of foretelling. I'm not going to sit here and say that, it's going to come to a point where if a riot breaks out, we're going to start scooping up people. But again, it's interesting. So again, I like the concept of the film. I guess I can go ahead and get into some of my issues with the film. And again, these are kind of like, small issues. I think for quite a bit in the film, to me, it takes a little bit to get going. I think there's a lot of scenes where you're kind of waiting for something to happen. Like, it's just trotting along, and, to me, that's a problem that I have with the film. I get that you have this little plot where Charlton Heston's investigating the death of, this character, and that's kind of a good chunk of the movie, where, Charlton Heston's investigating the death of this political figure, this higher up, that is a board member of the Soylent Corporation. And I get it's part of the story, but it's not the most interesting part. I mean, it's there, it's serviceable, but at times it just feels like we're just kind of trotting along here, like you're waiting for something to happen. And maybe that's pacing, even though it's an hour and a half, it's not a long movie at all. But my problem is, sometimes you're just kind of waiting for something to happen. And, and it does pick up, it does get interesting in the last 45 minutes of the film, especially in this one scene where the character Saul, goes to like this clinic for, it's like euthanasia, where he wants to commit suicide with the help of assistants. And that scene was really interesting because you have the character Saul laying in this bed, and he's listening to classical music because he goes to this clinic, and they're like, what's your favorite color? What's your favorite type of music? And the character Saul lays on this platform where the room is orange as his favorite color, and you have this classical music playing, and all of a sudden, like around this room, you have all these flashes of life and nature, like a lot of, imagery and visuals of nature and life, and then Charlton Heston's trying to, stop him from killing himself, and that's when Saul tells him to take action, because you find out something later about, the Soylent material that Saul had figured out. But that scene, the scene again where, Saul's in the room at the clinic and he dies. I mean, we don't see how he commits suicide. I mean, he just kind of lays on a table and he's kind of watching all these videos and images with, classical music playing in the back. Again, that's, to me, a really interesting scene. It almost seems like, death by nostalgia. Because, Saul's the type of character that remembers life from way back when. We used to eat this and that, and I remember how life was. And he, dies this way, where he remembers life a certain way, and nature, and the beauty of nature, and the beauty of life. And, he's in this room where, and that's my washing machine making a noise. But again, we don't see how he dies, but he just kind of dies peacefully. And apparently, Edward G. Robinson died shortly after filming that scene, or not too long after filming that scene, which is weird. Yeah, I read that in the trivia. And again, it's in that same scene that he tells, Charlton Heston what's going on. And that's where you get into the third act of the film, where Charlton Heston, basically, spoiler alert, so they take the body of Saul, and Charlton Heston follows the body to the Soylent Corporation, and you see where this is going. Basically, what we find out is that the Soylent Green material is made up of humans, dead bodies, and that's where you get the line at the end, Soylent Green are people, or is people. So that's what you find out about the material, about this food. And, so the third act, Charlton Heston, finding out about Soylent, and he gets into a little fight with Chuck Connors, which isn't much. So maybe, I could say the ending of the film is not impactful. And maybe that's the word I was looking for, earlier. Impact. The story is really interesting, but it's like the film to me lacks a lot of punch or impact, and you're just kind of waiting for, again, something to happen. But yeah, that's what we find out about the Soylent material. And overall, I would say overall thoughts on Soylent Green here. I would say it's a decent film. It's a decent watch. Again, Charlton Heston does fine in the acting. The supporting characters, they're there. The idea is really interesting and eye-opening. Especially the plot. I'll give it that. It's not a long film at all. Hour and a half maybe. But, for me at times, I did feel the pacing a little bit in the first half, where you're just kind of, waiting for something to happen, and, you're kind of like, okay, where's this going? Where's this going? It's like, even for this type of idea, you're kind of wondering, like, are they going to go farther? And maybe that's another thing too, like with this type of an idea for a movie, this concept, you're just kind of, I was hoping that they would go in farther places. I don't know, but again, it's a decent watch. A couple of flaws in regards to impact, maybe I would say pacing. I think the film didn't trot along at points. So Charlton Heston again is fine, and there's some interesting scenes here. So yeah, again, decent movie, decent watch. But yeah, so that's my review of Soylent Green. Thank you guys for watching, and up next, I'll be talking about and reviewing Westworld, which is actually probably my favorite film of this pack here. But thank you for watching, and have a good day.